Recording this. That's great. We have done that. Good afternoon. This is the Kenton Chamber of Commerce, and we're very excited to be able to welcome our State Comptroller, Thomas DiNapoli, of another Italian. I know you get that all the time, but I love that about you, to tell you the truth. The one thing I didn't tell you was that my husband is a retiree. So he's he worked for the Aquatic and Fitness Center in the town of Tonawanda with our Youth Parks and Recreation Department for 32 years. So we depend on a good pension fund. And I know that the valuation is coming up again soon.
I'd like Very soon. Yeah, I got to talk about that. But he has nothing to worry about. So just,
Stock market seems to be doing okay. So, yeah. But I am going to put my and people, if you put this on speaker view, it makes it a little easier to see people, the person who is speaking, and then the rest of people who are either napping or on their phones go to the side of your screen. And I would very much like to welcome Thomas DiNapoli, and I know you have a lot to share with us today, so take it away.
Kathy, thank you very much for hosting me and hosting all of your members and colleagues at the Kenmore-Tonawanda Chamber of Commerce. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I want to again thank Carl Zarek for suggesting that we do this. I'll look forward to a future opportunity to be with all of you in person, but for now we will take advantage of technology and communicate through this virtual environment. Kathy and I were chatting for a bit before we started, and she gave me an update on what's been happening in your area, and certainly a sense that we're in a better place generally now that we're seeing improvement as far as the public health side, the numbers, vaccination rate increasing, but there's still many challenges out there for the business community, for small business particularly. And that's really where I want to commend Kathy and all the members of the chamber, Scott Swan, your president or board chair, I guess is the title, but all of you for supporting the chamber. When I was a local member of the assembly, I was a member of the Chamber of Commerce in my home community of Great Neck down on Long Island. And the chambers, in good times and bad, play such an important role to bring together key stakeholders, business community, government leaders, nonprofit sector, which is such an important area of employment in all of our communities at this point in our history. So, I really appreciate, and Kathy filled me in on how challenging it was. Some of the members not able to pay their regular dues, and some of the staff not able to work, just all the challenge, not able to do events. And yet Kathy is still smiling and still positive and upbeat, and through it all was providing great support. I know many of the officers and board members really stepped up to help keep the work of the chamber going. So really my compliments to all of you for that. I also want to mention that Patrick Kennedy from our Intergovernmental Relations and Community Affairs Division is on the call. Patrick is our Western New York regional rep, and he's also a hometown guy from your community. So if there are any questions or follow-up that come out of our conversation today, Patrick will be there as a resource and to work with all of you. I know something of your community, partially because I served for 20 years in the State Assembly, and Robin Schimminger always talked about Kenmore-Tonawanda.
Yes.
So I know Robin, a legendary member of the Assembly, and certainly a great leader on economic development issues. As you know, he chaired the Commerce Committee for many years, and we wish him well in his retirement. And your current Albany representatives, Senator Sean Ryan and Assemblymember Bill Conrad, are working right now on the state budget. There's a lot going on here in Albany. I'll give you a quick update on some of that from our perspective. I know there are many folks on the call, and I gather someone else who I know well over many years from when she served in elective office, and I know now she works for Empire State Development, an important part of economic development. That's Lynne Marinelli. So again, welcome to all of you. My congratulations to all of you for supporting the chamber through the tough times we've been through, and continued support as we could turn the corner. Look, there's no doubt that whenever I talk to chambers, I don't have to tell you, you're on the front lines of what's been happening. The impact of COVID-19, obviously, first concern is from a health perspective, and I hope all of you are safe and well and have not been touched too directly by what we've been going through from a health perspective. But the impact on businesses and by extension government, because of the close down of the economy and the relatively slow reopening, really has affected us all. Of course, where you sit in Western New York, you have a dynamic that's different than many other parts of the state. You have an international border. So communities like Tonawanda and Kenmore, you have an even greater challenge with the border being closed back in last March. And that proximity to Canada, which you benefit from in so many ways, has really been on hold. I know that your Congressman, Brian Higgins, someone else who I served with in the Assembly for a number of years, is doing a great job for you in Washington. He has been in the forefront of urging the Biden and Trudeau administrations to begin a partial reopening of the border, hopefully by Memorial Day, and then phase in a more complete reopening for early summer. So, certainly I think those efforts are important. And again, whenever we're considering state policy, we need to keep in mind each region has its own dynamic, and certainly your being on the international border is something that we need to keep in mind. I mentioned, and I will mention a little more, about local government, but I do want to give a shout out to some of your local leaders who really have been ably navigating through this challenging time. So certainly with the town of Tonawanda, in addition to mentioning Carl, as I did, your supervisor, Joe Eminger. I know there's been a steady hand of fiscal stewardship in the town that goes back before the pandemic, and there's been effective management through the pandemic. Likewise, for the village of Kenmore, Mayor Patrick Mang and his team also working very diligently. And I gather that Supervisor John Whitney from Grand Island is on the call as well. So I thank Supervisor Whitney for his dedicated public service through this challenging time. If there are any other local officials whose name I don't have, I apologize for not giving you a shout out, but your support and working collaboratively with the chamber continues to be important, will be important as we get to a point of recovery. So, thank you all for your public service. This really has been a case of perseverance, certainly with regard to our small businesses. But although, as I was saying speaking with Kathy before we started the call, we could say with some confidence the worst is behind us. We know it's not totally done. We've even had some members of my team be diagnosed with COVID, and some of them with some severe symptoms just in the past 2 weeks. So the need to continue to be vigilant, the masks that we're used to, the washing of hands. Hopefully, I'm not a doctor, but I got my 2 shots of Pfizer. I hope all of you are doing what you can to get your vaccinations. And, as I was mentioning to Kathy, that's another case of perseverance. The websites don't work so well. My personal experience was just being persistent with the 800 number and finally getting somebody who was helpful enabled me to get scheduled for the shot. So I know it's been frustrating for some. Hopefully, as we get more vaccines allocated, that will ease up. But we need to continue to follow the science. Obviously, the numbers are much better in terms of hospitalizations, but we know there are still new cases happening. There are still deaths happening. And certainly for Western New York, your region has seen improvement, although we've seen, even just in the past couple of days, some uptick in some of the parts of our state. So anyway, let me talk about some economic data, some of what we're seeing with state budget. I'll talk a little bit about pension fund as well, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions or any thoughts that you want to share with me. So the economy, it took a big hit when everything closed down going back a year ago. You certainly saw in April, May, the severe downturn in terms of employment, double-digit unemployment in the state. We have come a long way back from that situation. We're not back to where we were pre-pandemic. But the latest numbers for the start of 2021, the New York State unemployment rate is about 8.8%. One of the drags on the unemployment figure has been New York City. New York City has been underperforming relative to the rest of the state. There, the unemployment rate's about 12.6% because the city, given everything that's been happening there, the reopening has been much slower. You know, the concern is an obvious one. The city of New York is in many ways the economic engine for the state. It's not the only economic engine, but it is a key part of the revenues that get generated that we all benefit from. So New York City lagging in terms of recovery is affecting all of us. And certainly as the process of reopening continues to happen there, we hope those numbers will turn around pretty quickly. For Erie County, you're at about 7.9%. These are January numbers, the latest final numbers that we have. So again, obviously much better than, I guess you're at 18% back in April of 2020. So that's an improvement. You're a little better than the state numbers right now. New York lost just between March and April of 2020 about 1.9 million jobs. We've regained back about, well, over 900,000 of those jobs thus far. So we're still down from where we were compared to last year. When we look at the Buffalo Niagara region, again, we see that jobs have been coming back, but you're still lagging the pre-COVID job levels. So again, looking January to January, 2020 to 2021, you're down about 8.7% in terms of jobs lost, about 48,000 jobs. A number that I like to, and I'll try not to throw too many numbers at you, but what we do in the controller's office is work with a lot of numbers. You know, a figure I want to share with you, which I really think underscores at a very personal level, a household level, the economic devastation from what we've been going through. We're the back end of the process of paying out unemployment benefits. Department of Labor does most of the work there, but we're the ones who do the final processing of the payments and the checks. So over the past year or so, we're going back to March 1st of 2020 to where we're at right now. We have paid out unemployment benefits of over $74 billion in New York State, $74 billion. For all of the year 2019, for the previous year, we paid out just a little over $2 billion. $2 billion in unemployment benefits pre-pandemic, $74 billion during the pandemic. I mean, it really just shows how many people have been hurt in very direct and personal ways. So we need to keep that in mind. We talk a lot about the business community, but as I alluded to earlier, and I'm sure many of your members are either employed in the not-for-profit area or your business people that serve on not-for-profit boards. Certainly the nonprofit sector has been hurt as well. The pandemic for many of the direct service providers and nonprofits resulted in an increase in demand for services. At the same time that the ability to raise money, fundraising certainly was way off. Events couldn't happen. People weren't able to give. And government funding was also down. Delays in payments and contracts, anticipated 20% budget cuts at one time. That's not what's happening right now, but that's what had been projected. So many of the nonprofits across the state have been hurt very significantly. It's been the same situation nationally. For New York State, because the nonprofit sector provides one out of every 6 private sector jobs, it really is a concern. So when we talk about employment, I always try to remind everybody we need to think not just about private sector, business community employment, not just about government employment, but the nonprofit sector is a big part of the employment picture in our state. Tax receipts certainly have improved, particularly when we look at the various kinds of taxes coming in at the state level. There are continued risks. You know, one of the prime indicators that we look at in terms of the revenue picture, sales tax. We under normal times, we do quarterly reporting of sales tax. We've been doing monthly reporting, again, because folks have wanted this information. You know, so we saw back in the second quarter of 2020, which was, you know, April, May, June, when the pandemic was at the height in terms of the economic close down, the state lost 27% in sales tax revenue just in that quarter. It started to come back in the third quarter, minus 9.5%. In the fourth quarter that ended December 31st, down 7%. For all of 2020, the state was down in local sales tax collections by 10%. Again, the big drag in terms of the statewide numbers was New York City, down close to 19%. For the counties outside of New York City, actually there was a slight gain I'm sorry, many of the counties had a slight gain. The overall, when you add all the counties outside of New York City, it was a minus only 0.9%. So when we talk about that minus 10% for all of the year, it really was what was happening in New York City that really had a big impact on our revenue. Thus far, it's still down. I mean, again, not down as bad as it was in 2020, but for January and February of this year, we're down statewide about 5.1%. For Erie County, just by way of comparison to those state numbers, for all of 2020, it was a minus 1.8% in sales tax revenue. So certainly better than the minus 10% in terms of the statewide numbers. Thus far, for January, February, Erie County is down about 5%, so pretty much in line with what we're seeing with the statewide numbers. We'll see what March brings in, and when there's a reconciliation at the end of the quarter, what that shows. What's also happening, though, when you look at where the sales tax collections are coming from, it's very clear that there are shifts in consumer spending, and you're probably seeing that in your community as well. Restaurants and places to eat, travel accommodations, clothing stores, each experience very steep decreases in year-over-year taxable sales. And as you know, certainly in my community where I live and when I'm in the city, although mostly in Albany, some of those establishments are closed and they're not coming back. So that's something we're all going to have to face. The reality is spending in other areas has increased. So information services, internet content, electronic shopping, mail order houses, and now we're collecting sales tax, as you know, on the online sales. Those were up significantly in 2020. Parenthetically, sales of beer, wine, and liquor has also been up significantly. So I think we can understand why in that regard. But I think that's, one of the trends we're going to have to look at. I'll be curious to see what thoughts some of you may have. How permanent will that shift be in terms of the move to online shopping? And what will be the implication for our small businesses as we move forward? So although there have been losses, the fact that we are now collecting the sales tax from the online shopping has certainly eased some of what could have been an even more difficult situation in terms of revenue on the sales tax side. Overall, we had been projecting going back a number of months, more optimistic numbers in terms of overall tax collections, both in terms of not just sales tax, but personal income tax, which is the biggest tax source for the state, and other kinds of business taxes as well. Division of Budget has certainly repeatedly increased its projections of what the tax revenue will be, the tax receipts. So about $5 billion more projected, higher than the mid-year update, still off by about $3.5 billion compared to previous year's tax receipts. But again, we're seeing growth. We put out our February numbers and what we do a monthly cash report. And again, still seeing $255 million higher than Division of Budget's latest estimate. So every time we look at the revenue, the hard data coming in, we keep beating projections. So I guess that's good news. But are we back to where we were over a year ago? No, but it is getting better. For local governments, your tax mix is a little different. Sales tax is important to the counties, and most of the counties share some of that with towns, villages, and cities. Obviously, cities' sales tax is important as well. Property tax tends to be most important for our local governments, including school districts. Generally, property taxes are a more stable kind of tax source. I think one of the trends we have to look at moving forward are a couple. Number one, if people continue to be out of work, are they going to have a problem paying their property taxes? Will that impact on revenue at the local level, tax revenue at the local level? Also, this has been a particular issue in New York City. It may be in your area as well. Because of the economic impact of what we've been going through, will many more property owners, especially on the commercial side, look to have reassessment of their property and bringing down, the assessment rolls, and will that have long-term implications? Again, because of money interest rates being so low, when we put out the tax cap calculations, as we're required to do, for local governments, it's getting tighter. That for local governments with fiscal years that end on December 31st, the tax cap is going to be 1.56% for 2021, under 2% for the first time in 3 years. For school districts, tax cap is 1.23%, down from 1.8% last year. So, I know our local governments like to live within the means of the tax cap. That's going to become a little more challenging based on some of those numbers. What's going on in Albany right now, I'll give you a quick update because there's a lot changing really moment to moment here, is what's happening on negotiating the state budget. There are other things going on in Albany, but I won't talk about that. I'll focus on budget. The budget picture has changed significantly because of the uptick in revenues and because of what has been coming out of Washington with the American Rescue Plan and more aid that the new administration has proposed. And now, as you know, the Congress has approved and authorized. So going back to the governor's executive proposal in January, the governor had indicated a conservative budget estimate of $6 billion in additional federal money over the next 2 years, hoping for $15 billion. The $6 billion figure included some expected cuts in spending, increased taxes in a couple of areas, delaying the middle class tax cut, higher income taxes on upper income New Yorkers, trying to seek more revenue with mobile sports betting and legalization of adult use marijuana. And the more optimistic budget, assuming a $15 billion of new federal aid, not having to do the tax increases, still do some of those other revenue raisers. The budget included some new areas of spending that I think people were pleased about. More money for infrastructure, particularly environmental infrastructure, $500 million more for the Clean Water Infrastructure Act. Funding for CHIPS and Marcaselli, which helps our local governments with roads and highways and so on, would continue to be funded at the same level. Money, $100 million for the Bridge New York and Pave New York, again, key transportation programs that our local governments are concerned about. I won't go into a lot of the other proposals, unless you want to talk about some of them, but what's happened now, to fast forward, we had the governor's executive proposal, and then last week, the Assembly and the Senate passed their one House budget resolutions, their take on spending. And that's where you see some differences. So for instance, with the CHIPS funding, the Senate added $150 million. The Assembly added $65 million for the Winter Recovery Program. There was big changes of the one House bills with regard to AIM funding. Again, I won't get into too much detail, but the local town and village officials care about AIM a great deal. The state has been moving away from direct funding for AIM, reducing the funding, going to AIM-related payments that come out of county sales tax revenue. Basically, the legislature is trying to reverse that, go back to state funding for direct funding for AIM and bring it back to the $715 million level that had been in the past before the cuts in 2019. And in fact, in one of the one House bills, the Assembly bill actually sought to increase the AIM funding as well. So, the challenge now is to reconcile the differences between the executive budget proposal, the Assembly proposal, and the Senate proposal. The Senate and Assembly proposals are very similar, some differences in spending. Both of them would include some significant tax increases in a host of areas, restoring the middle income tax cut that had been proposed to be deferred. It's a big source of debate right now. Why is it a big source of debate? Well, we've been looking at the additional money that's coming to New York from the American Rescue Plan. And what we see that we're receiving is, out of that $1.9 trillion plan, a significant influx of money for New York State, some $12.6 billion directly to the state, but also significant amounts of money that'll be targeted to counties and localities and education, healthcare, go down the list. The budget director, as some of you may have seen just the other day, said based on the revenue trends, meaning the uptick in revenue that I alluded to earlier in terms of tax revenue, and as we're reading the fine print on what's coming to New York from the American Rescue Plan, found another $5 billion in revenue that had not been anticipated for the state. So, and that was just announced on Monday. So, what's going on now is a real debate between those that are still arguing that there are some folks that have done very well during the pandemic. As is often the case, wealthy people tend to get more wealthy no matter what. And at a time where many people have been hurting, there still should be tax increases, particularly on the upper end of the income scale. Many others, particularly in the business community, have been arguing that the economic recovery is fragile. Any taxes, especially if they go down into what might be described as the middle class or the upper middle class, some of the targeted business taxes like the stock transfer tax would put us backward in terms of the recovery. So, that's really the struggle that's going on right now between the three parties. It's not clear how it will play out in the end. We have to get a budget done by April 1st. My perspective always is, as controller, I respect the fact that the legislature and the governor have to make the decisions on spending and revenue. That's not my job, but what we look at is budget balance. No doubt we'll be able to balance the budget for the coming year, but we've always had out-year budget caps. Good times and bad. New York always starts with a built-in structural imbalance. So what we're really going to be looking for, will we have recurring revenue matching recurring spending? And we have to recognize that this money that we're getting from Washington is not forever. And so we should not act like it will be forever, and we should spend it carefully, hopefully spend it over time as much as we can. For local governments outside of New York City, you're talking about another $4.9 billion in money that will come out of the American Rescue Plan. Erie County will get about $178 million, Tonawanda over $42 million. This funding can be used obviously for COVID-related impacts in many areas, including help for small businesses and nonprofits, direct aid to industries that have been impacted, particularly tourism, travel, and hospitality. Obviously, support for the essential workers who've been doing so much throughout this time, help repair revenue losses caused by COVID, investment in infrastructure, particularly water, sewer, broadband. And as you know, the president is talking about the next step, coming up with a major infrastructure proposal. We'll see if that comes to pass. But to the extent that you may have as a chamber or as individuals thoughts on some of this spending, or on the revenue side, the tax side, now is the time, if you haven't already, to be in touch with Senator Ryan, Assemblymember Conrad, because the conference committees now are meeting, they're sharing thoughts, and we are all expecting a three-way agreement sometime between today and April 1st to get the budget done. A couple of other quick things, and then I'll turn it back for discussion or questions. State pension fund, that's one of our big responsibilities in managing the pension fund. The good news is New York's pension fund has always been one of the best funded in the country, with the third largest of all the public pension plans. We had our own challenges with COVID-19. We value the fund based on the state fiscal year. So March 31st is when we value the fund. So I always say, heading in the last week of March, especially now with the religious holidays kicking in, go to church or synagogue, light a candle so that we end up with a good day on March 31st. And that point was driven home severely last year, because the low point in the markets, as you recall, when they tanked, was March 23rd. So we started March of 2020 with a very strong year, double-digit positive return, and we were really anticipating great news to report to the taxpayers, to the local governments, to our retirees. Within the last 2 weeks of March, we went from a strong positive to a negative. We had a negative 2.68% return for 2020. We had not had a negative return on the pension fund investments for 10 years. 10 years before, when the Great Recession hit, March was also the low point of the markets. That year, we lost 26% value in 1 year, 26% value in 1 year. So minus 2.68% was certainly a much more manageable decrease. But we did have to up the contribution rate that we charge to our government employers. We don't like doing that. We like to keep the rate stable or reduce them. But, you know, my goal as trustee is to keep the plan well funded. We, in the last rankings that are based on 2018 numbers, is always a lag, we were ranked as the #2 pension fund in terms of how well funded we are, at 98% funded. So we're very proud of that. Certainly with the loss we had last March, we went down. The good news is now we are back up. We're back well into the 90s as a percentage of how well funded we are. At the end of December, our estimated value was $247.7 billion. Keep in mind, at the end of March last year, we were at $194 billion. So a significant rebound from where we were at. We're paying out now over $1 billion a month in benefits to our retirees. So about $13 billion a year we're paying out in benefits. 80% of our retirees continue to live in New York State after they retire. So I always like to remind people that means 80% of that $13 billion is money being spent right here in New York, in local economies, paying taxes, keeping people in New York. So bottom line for our retirees is the pensions are safe and well funded. Barring another event like a pandemic or a market collapse between now and March 31st, we're going to have a very, very strong year. What does that mean to our friends in local government? I'm hoping it means at a minimum, the rates will stay stable. If we can lower the contribution rate, which helps you with your budgets and helps our taxpayers, we will try. But keep in mind, my job as trustee is to keep the plan well funded. We have a long-term assumed rate of return of 6.8%. We're a little more conservative than other pension plans. We probably would like to be positioned even more conservative than that. So that's part of what we're balancing when we put all the factors that go into the final calculation for the contribution rate. But the plan is well funded. We continue to allocate money. We're not just in the stock market. It's important for me to say. We're in a lot of money in fixed income, which of course doesn't generate a lot of money, but that's the safe place to put money. And we do have some money in alternatives like private equity, real estate, and real assets. We continue to allocate capital. Again, I'm trying to get a good return first and foremost, but we have our in-state private equity investment program where we do allocate capital on an equity basis to businesses that are starting up or are located in New York. We also support small business lending. And I mention this because some of you all may be familiar with what had been called the New York Business Development Corporation. Now it's called Pursuit Lending. Pursuit does loans to small businesses for working capital, equipment, and real property. They have a goal of minimum 25% lending for women and minority small businesses. But we provide the capital that supports many of those small business loans. So if you're interested in the Pursuit program or that in-state private equity program, feel free to follow up with Patrick and he can get you more information about that. I'll just wrap up by referring you to our website at your convenience. We always have a lot of information there, but we have updated what we have now as part of the website, a financial survival toolkit for New Yorkers that are dealing with COVID-19, information for small businesses, information on healthcare, employment opportunities, what New York State is trying to do to help. Also, there's a site with Q&A for our local government officials that's new with the COVID experience. We continue to do all we can to return people's lost money with unclaimed funds. Erie County alone has close to 300,000 unclaimed fund accounts totaling over $150 million. So if you remember nothing else about what I say, when you go to your computer tonight to check your email, go to the Comptroller's website, click on unclaimed funds, put your business name in, your personal name, your nonprofit, your local government, any organization you're attached to, also names of friends and relatives, including deceased relatives. We may need more documentation, but you may have an estate situation from a parent or a grandparent. We want to return that money to you. We are returning now well over $1 million a day in unclaimed funds, but we have more money we want to get out there. So, people ask me all the time, am I optimistic, pessimistic? I'm always an optimist. That's why I stay in government. But, I do think we're seeing significant economic recovery in many parts of the state. The federal money came in much higher than many of us would have first expected. But all that being said, a lot will ride on the state budget decisions that are being made by the legislature and the governor over the next few days. And I do think that this economic recovery that I'm sure is underway, even if there may be some very quick upticks that we're starting to see in certain sectors with the reopening, I do think we have to be careful. I think it's going to take a number of years for us to get back to where we were. Some sectors of the economy are going to do better, faster than others, but overall, I still think the recovery is going to be somewhat tenuous. And so we're going to continue to do all that we can to look at the trends, to share information. That's a lot of what we do in the Comptroller's office. I do that with confidence about our future. We've been through tough times before, the Great Recession. I mentioned we lost 26% value of the pension fund in 1 year. Businesses were hurt. We got through that. As a downstater, I lived through 9/11, and many of us thought we'd never get back to anything like normal after that, and we did. The pandemic has had its own unique and troubling dynamics, but we're going to get through this. Americans will get through it. New Yorkers will get through it. I just think we have to be careful and thoughtful, and that's where it gets back to Kenmore-Tonawanda Chamber of Commerce. We need to be sharing thoughts. We need to be supporting each other. We need to be bringing together business and nonprofits and government and coming up with strategies that are mutually reinforcing. And that's something, sometimes I don't think we do a good enough job of at the state level. I think sometimes you do a better job of it at the local level. So I really appreciate the time and courtesy you've given me. Probably, Kathy, I overstayed my welcome, but I'm not rushing out. So if anybody wants to ask any questions or have any thoughts to share, I'll turn it back to Kathy and be happy to talk further with you.
Thank you. This was very informative. Obviously, a lot of numbers there. I tried to write a few things down, but you did mention earlier, and I appreciate you thanking our local town government. We're really very fortunate here in the town of Tonawanda with our supervisor and our town board, but Joe Eminger is a businessman, and he looks at things that way. And I think that has really served this community well. And, for years to come. We've got elections coming up, whatever. And, but I don't think he's going anywhere. You've got a tough job there. I understand from a business, and I'm looking at this from my business's point of view, that we don't want any more taxes. And I don't want taxes on people who are making money, because I know they're going to put it back in the economy. However, I understand that from a budget line standpoint, if you're looking at charging X amount of dollars, then you can see where that's going to come in, and it can take care of expenses, etc. The unknown is how much money are people going to spend if they have the money and aren't being taxed. So that's a tough thing. But I will always
just underscore that one of the big issues is, especially during the pandemic, a lot of folks have and some of this particularly relates to the New York City experience. Many folks have decamped to other locations within New York or to other states, and they found it's pretty easy, especially with the virtual environment. And you do reach a point, especially with folks who may already have an out-of-state residence. Obviously, Florida is the most common one that people talk about. If you increase the tax burden to the point that it makes more sense to change your legal residence so you don't have to pay those taxes, you can keep your business in New York through the virtual environment. And because I know it's a tough one for, sometimes for people to appreciate, but the top 1% of taxpayers pay 40% of the income tax for the state. There is going to be a tipping point where some of those folks are going to say it's not worth it. And the real concern is, will some of those folks then take the jobs with them if they leave? And that's why there was a letter signed by, 150 of the business leaders in New York City, really urging the governor and the legislature not to do the kind of surcharges that they're talking about. The governor had initially proposed, I would say, what I would call a modest tax increase, and maybe, for very upper income New Yorkers, and maybe that's something that, that would be sustainable. But when you add on the other kinds of business taxes that are being proposed, one of the concerns that I have, just in terms of approach, is, and again, I respect that I'm not in the legislature. That's what they're elected to do, not me. But we're getting all this federal money beyond what many people would have expected. And instead of saying, okay, it's plugging the holes that we have, and how can we be more efficient, moving forward? The knee-jerk reaction of some is, well, we're going to spend all the federal money, and we're going to raise taxes to spend even more money. And maybe some of what they're trying to do, especially on healthcare and education, is something we'd all like to see. But it always seems to me there's the rush to spend the money, raise the taxes, without looking at the question of what are we spending it on, and are there some smarter ways to be spending it? And I guess the perspective I have as controller, we do audits all the time. A big part of our operation are audits of state spending and of local government spending. You take a program like Medicaid, very expensive program. We're always finding inefficiency, some cases fraud, and when you accumulate it, I mean, you're talking not just in the millions or the tens of millions, the hundreds, you're talking about billions. And instead of trying to be smarter, which when you don't have the pressure of the kind of deficits that we thought we were going to have, take the time to be smart and make spending decisions that don't rely just on spending all the money you got and then taxing first before you decide what are the priorities and how do we spend it smartly. And I know when you're in the legislature, you got to get a budget done and you're running for election. That's not exactly the first thing people think about, right? But that's where I do have a concern that some of the folks, almost in a way that when you listen to some of the rhetoric, it's almost a feeling of we got to punish people who've done well. And we're going to put out our Wall Street report on Friday. That's another report we do on an annual basis on the bonuses. It's a record year for Wall Street bonuses. And a lot of people can say, oh, those people, they do well while the rest of us are hurting. But you know what? One of the reasons why we didn't have a worse picture financially than we would have had otherwise is that Wall Street is still in New York. And a lot of those people spend their money in New York, and we tax them, and we tax them mightily. And so, financial services accounts for about 18% of the revenue that funds everything else that we spend money on in New York. You could love Wall Street or hate it, and we could get into a whole discussion on regulation of the industry. But in New York, it's been important to us that they've been located here. We don't want to lose those jobs. We don't want to lose those folks that are making a lot of money, because we want them to pay their taxes and we want to use it. So it's not a science, right, Kat? It's an art in terms of balancing all of this, but I worry a little bit right now. Folks are not thinking as clearly as they should on the tax question.
We have a question, and I'll ask it here. Is there any update on whether New York State will waive the first $10,200 in unemployment as the federal government has done? So they just came out after I paid my taxes, and I was unemployed a little bit last year, that the first $10,200 in, I don't know if you have the answer to this, in our income from unemployment was not taxed from the federal, but it was taxed from the state. Any change to that?
I haven't got an update on anything final, but we tend to follow what the feds do. So don't take that as a definitive answer. Actually, I just had a conversation the other day with the Commissioner of Tax and Finance on a related question to this, because of the audits we do of the tax refund. So my understanding is this is very much under discussion right now. And you saw on the deadline when the feds changed it to May, we did, I think I would be surprised if we didn't follow the feds, but I'm not aware that we've done that yet. So
okay.
So don't take it to the bank, but that's the direction I think we're going.
It's a challenge. People are holding off on doing their taxes.
Sure.
It came probably 2 or 3 days after mine were filed and done, but it'll all work out in the wash next year.
Sure.
But and I didn't know if anyone else, if you don't mind putting question in the chat box. We've got a few minutes and we could answer any other questions. And if we don't get any of those, I just really want to thank you for, the tough job that you have there. And it is interesting, as you're watching what the groups are doing, that the legislature is doing, that you don't have any control over. Maybe, at least there's a voice of reason there somewhere that, to take a look very hard at how we are spending that money, and don't just blow it all and think long term too, because we don't know, if something like this could come around the bend again. I think we're all a little bit more heightened that it very possibly could. And so this is a different world. This is totally a different world. Yeah. But I'm getting a lot of thank yous in the chat box. Thank you very much for spending the time with us today. The Kenmore-Tonawanda Chamber of Commerce and all our businesses have been very much challenged this year, and as people have across the state. So it's good to hear, the good that you are doing, and that the state is working hard to continue with.
Most of our folks have been working remotely, but we've been getting the job done. We're paying the bills and getting the contracts approved and getting the pension checks out. And I'm very proud of the team that I have. And, look, Kathy, I hope down the road when I can be traveling again, you'll invite me to perhaps something in person, or, I'll come spend some money in Kenmore-Tonawanda. And, if we're still in a virtual environment, you want to do this again at some point, just let Patrick know. And if Patrick doesn't answer, Carl can call me directly, and we'll do this again. And I hope I didn't throw too much at all of you, but I really like to take the time with Chambers, because I know how important your work is, and the big strength of New York is what happens at the local level, and because of individuals and leaders like all of you. So again, Kathy, thank you so much for hosting me.
I had a question here, if you don't mind, from Nick Wojnar. He's a financial advisor. And Nick, if you could ask it in the chat, we could maybe get that answered for you. It would be a little simpler. But I did have another one here. How important is the federal adoption of raising the minimum wage to $15 to keep New York State competitive?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Actually, no one's ever asked me that question, but boy, does it make sense, because look, New York has tried to do the right thing in terms of raising the minimum wage. I think, in terms of that, that issue of businesses deciding to locate outside of the state, it certainly would be extremely helpful if there was a level playing field. $15 seems to be the number that most of the progressive and union groups that push for the increase in the minimum wage talk about. So I think it's a great question. And I think the answer clearly is that it would certainly help New York from a competitive point of view. And I would just dovetail on that, with the question of taxes too, because, sometimes when I express concern about raising the income tax in New York, people say, "Oh, Tom, what's that? Why are you being so, conservative about that?" And I said, look, I know some people can pay a little more, but keep in mind the federal government, that really is the level, and there probably will be some tax increases coming there. If it's a level playing field, why do we want to go so high on the income tax where we're not competitive anymore? And why make it easy for some of these folks to leave the state? So I do think, whether it's on the minimum wage or on the income tax, we need to be more mindful than we sometimes are about what it does to New York's competitive position. So I think that's a great question. And I think we should also appreciate the difference that having Chuck Schumer Senate Majority Leader, what a difference that made for us. So whatever your politics are, having a New Yorker as the Senate Majority Leader obviously helped a great deal in terms of the federal money that we're getting. And that really is going to be a lifesaver for getting us back to a stronger position. Let's keep that in mind as well.
That's great. And I'm not seeing any other questions come up, but I know that at least through Patrick, we can, get things answered and have a little communication. If anybody wants to reach out to me, I'd be very happy to, pass along some things and continue this conversation. And I think that's what makes it such a valuable offer that we have with our speaker series. And I'm just going to plug the chamber, because as I was saying to you earlier, my key is to lift all the boats. So that is one of the things that we have decided as a Chamber of Commerce to, it's not, none of these are specific to our members. They are, you know, we bring in great speakers and anybody can jump in on these calls, et cetera, and learn. So again, thank you for your time. I know it's a very, very busy time of year for you. So just to, you know, appreciate that and the great job that you've been doing and involved, what was it, since 2007 in our state government, one way or another. And
well, 1986 in the Assembly, 2007 in Comptroller. So,
oh, okay. So
I've been around the block a couple times.
Yeah.
But I love what I do, as I know all of you do. And Kathy, thanks again, and happy Easter and Passover for everyone who's celebrating that coming up. And happy spring. The weather's finally getting a little better. That should help us all too.
It should. That's absolutely right. Now let me see if I can get this last question in here, because there was the question from Nick. And Nick, okay, with regard, oh, when you put these numbers in here, I don't know what this means, but maybe Tom, you'll know. With regard to the ERS and TRS pension systems, sorry, you should know that.
Yeah.
How do you think COVID will impact the possibility of a new tier system or the possibility of moving the pension to a cash balance pension like Pennsylvania is?
Right. So no, I got the question. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, one of our strengths is how well funded we have been. You know, again, hopefully the next few days we'll continue to have the strong performance that we believe is going to be there. Again, after last year, we can't count anything until March 31st comes and goes. But you know, when you're at 98% funded plan, as we were in the last go around, we don't have the kind of crisis that Pennsylvania had, that Jersey, that Illinois, Kentucky, go down the list of many states, where they were compelled, Rhode Island, to change their benefit structure. So, you know, over the past, I guess, 12 years or so, we have changed the benefit structure. You know, it wasn't that long ago that we added a tier 5 and then a tier 6. So, you know, and there was some debate about that, right? Whether that made sense or not. I mean, there's no doubt in the long run, those new tiers are less costly to the plan. And part of why, you know, just looking at the numbers, we continue to be in strong shape is that you'd be surprised at the turnover and how many people now are tier 6. I forget the number on top of my head. I think it was like 30% or something like that. A very significant number. We have a faster turnover than many people had anticipated. Well, that's going to continue. So I think you're going to see there's still, believe it or not, a handful of tier 1 people around. Tier 4 is probably still the largest tier, but to a certain extent, as time goes on, the new tiers will reduce the costs. So because we're well funded, because we have more people in the less costly tiers, I don't personally support leaving the defined benefit system at this point. I don't see a need to do another tier, because, you know, tier 6 particularly is pretty big changes compared to tier 4. And I do think, you know, you're starting to hear some of this from you know, some of the public employee groups. You do get into a question of retention. I mean, part of why people often choose to work in government is that, you know, the pay not always be as good, but the big trade-off is at the end of 25 years or whatever the time frame is, you know, you have a defined benefit pension, which, as many of you know, in the private sector is much less prevalent than it was years ago. And because we've changed tier 6 very differently than what tier 4 was, and we changed the vesting as well, you know, 10-year vesting instead of the 5-year, you know, many folks are not necessarily making that commitment, you know, to stay in public service as people did before. So, you know, my view is this: we should be fortunate, especially those of us who are in the system, with the plan that we have. Because the other thing I get is, you know, some folks want to see enhancements, you know, increase the COLA, right? We have a pretty conservative cost of living increase for retirees, and my retiree friends are always saying, when are you going to increase the COLA? And I say, you know what? Some folks want to see us move away from a defined benefit pension or have a new tier that's less advantageous to the employees. You want to see the COLA increase, which would raise costs. Let's just be happy with what we have now. And I'm very much of the view, we did 2 new tiers during my tenure. I don't see a need, as long as we're as well funded as we are, to do another tier. The other states that have moved, they've had to, because they're not well funded and they could never make up, the kind of liabilities that they had. That's not our situation in New York. As I said, and I'll end on this. I know when we had the slight decrease last year, we did have to increase the contribution rate. I didn't like doing that. And my goal is for us to get back to stable rates. Hopefully, if we could do a reduction, but we're also going to position the fund a little more conservatively, I think, with our assumptions. So, the goal is to keep a defined benefit plan at a level that taxpayers can afford to sustain it. Retirement security, though, is a big issue for many people in America. Everybody's living a lot longer, or most of us are, and many people do not have retirement income. They don't have a pension, or they have a very modest 401k. At some point, that is going to be a big societal issue that we're going to have to confront. So I don't want to abandon the kind of retirement security that we have for our 1.1 million New Yorkers who are part of our plan. But it's a good question. Timely.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it is what you just said there at the end is the reason. I mean, I have always believed in having a financial planner. Nick Woshnar is a financial advisor, and he's the one that asked that question. And really, I think the benefit to everybody would be to have a financial planner, so you can really take a look, and get in there early.
Yeah. And just, to Nick's question, just to give you a little more, just was handed on the numbers. So tier 3 and 4 is the biggest number of our active employees right now. That's at about 311,000 members are in 3 and 4. Tier 6 right now, this doesn't even include tier 5, which is kind of a small group. Tier 5 wasn't open for very long, is already up to about 286,000.
Oh.
So it's pretty much catching up to, probably will soon overtake tiers 3 and 4. It's a much less expensive and less beneficial to the employees tier system already. So while I'm defending the defined benefit system rather than defined contribution, keep in mind those 2 new tiers that we did a few years ago, 10 years ago, has had a big impact on the cost of the plan already.
Yeah, that's an expensive one for sure. So, but again, thank you for your time here. We actually went just about exactly an hour, and I appreciate very much, and maybe we can do a follow-up in a year, and but come back to Buffalo as soon as things get safe around here. And
I'm overdue. I'm not doing Dingus Day this year, though. You will not see me on Dingus Day.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Have a fabulous afternoon. Thomas DiNapoli, we appreciate your time here today.
Thanks,
take care.